Thank you, Professor Perry. Thank you all. I'm going to start with a sort of general remark, and which is that the victory of Lenin in Russia in 1917 and the victory of Mao and company in China in 1949 may have led to a certain undermining and undervaluing of socialist traditions other than Marxism. I think this is true of the historiographical literature at a certain point of time. It's also true of political focus, and especially focus in the American and Western Academy on what socialism meant. And then, of course, there was Vietnam. And what is common between Vietnam, China, and Russia is not only that they all represented victories of certain Marxist-Leninist traditions, but also that the leadership was incredibly charismatic. I mean, the figures of Lenin, Mao, and Ho Chi Minh carried a kind of aura and authority born out of their struggles in leadership. Whether you liked them or hated them, they were larger-than-life figures. And in some ways, one could argue that India is different in two respects. One is that there wasn't a successful Marxist revolution, though actually this makes it in some ways quite interesting because there were alternate non-Marxist socialist traditions that had been influential and important at various points in the 20th century. And there wasn't apparently a charismatic socialist leader. There are a couple of options as to who you would consider an Indian charismatic socialist leader, and I'll throw them out in a minute. But since India did not have a successful Marxist revolution which led to the establishment of a one-party state, we have had, as I speak as an Indian, through the 20th century, a very interesting dynamic between Marxist, broadly Marxist, and non-Marxist socialist traditions. Some landmarks: the founding of the Communist Party of India in 1921, so to say representing the mother lode of party Marxism, which of course then splits into different directions, but 1921 is the founding of the Communist Party of India. And 1934 is the founding of the Congress Socialist Party, a ginger group within the mainstream Indian National Congress, which is of course the major popular vehicle for the articulation of Indian nationalist aspirations. And it's really the Congress and its success which in many ways determined the fact that there was no successful Marxist revolution in India, unlike China and Vietnam. But within the Congress, you had an organization which has not yet found its historian. The Congress Socialist Party, which was founded in 1934 and effectively disbanded in 1942 with the Quit India movement. So the formal disbanding took place only a little later. Now, these organizations took different careers. From the Communist Party of India, founded in 1921, it carried on through till the early 60s when it split into two parties, one broadly pro-Soviet, one kind of equidistant, both working within the parliamentary tradition. Then you had a third split when you had, in the late 1960s, something called the Maoist movement, the Communist Party of India, Marxist-Leninist, which has had many fragments since. The socialists likewise have had different kind of incarnations. So you had the Congress Socialist Party within the Congress. After independence, many Congress socialists left the Congress, started a socialist party. That split into a Praja Socialist Party, a Samyukta Socialist Party. You have various fragments in India today claiming direct descendants from those socialist traditions. So you had these two socialist traditions whose interactions I like to look at a little more closely, ideological interactions, not so much personal interactions. Because both the Marxists, in their different incarnations, and the socialists have had an enormous influence on Indian politics, Indian society, Indian intellectual work, cultural work. Many of India's finest writers, literary figures, filmmakers, theatre personalities have owed allegiance either to the communist or to the non-communist socialist tradition. So this dialectic or dynamic between the Marxists and the non-Marxist socialists is, I think, something that the opportunity of participating in this panel allowed me to reflect upon this, because it hasn't really been written about. But it's actually, when I look about it, when this invitation came and I thought about what I could speak on, I realized how productive and rich an area this was for historical and sociological inquiry, and so under-researched. So, what were the differences between the Marxists, broadly speaking, as a broad brush perspective, what were the differences between the Marxist socialists, the Marxist tradition in India and the non Marxist socialist traditions? Now, clearly, there were differences vis a vis foreign policy. The Marxists were pro Soviet and then pro China, and the socialists were ambivalent about the Soviet Union. Ambivalent about the Soviet Union because while they admired the national unification, the industrialization drive, they were Democrats, so they weren't appreciative of the absolutist state. But while they were ambivalent about the Soviet Union, the non-Marxist Indian socialists were hostile to China. And the hostility arose principally out of the border dispute. Now, the Indian socialists were patriots first and socialists second, whereas, of course, the Indian Marxists would have seen themselves as internationalists, and the cynics would say that they were not internationalists. Their patriotic allegiance was to the Soviet Union or to China, depending on that, on the fragment of the movement they were part of. But on China, the Indian socialists always were, not very comfortable with because of the long-standing border dispute, something I'll actually speak about under the auspices of the Yenching Institute tomorrow. However, the major differences between the Marxists and the socialists in India have had to do with domestic politics, not with foreign policy. And there are 3 or 4 very interesting and important differences I'd like to direct your attention to. The first, of course, is the difference between violence and non-violence. For all Marxists, even Marxists in power, for example, the Marxists who have been in power in West Bengal for the last 33 years, coming to power through the ballot box, in theory, they still believe in armed revolution, whereas the socialists, in a sense, abandoned that belief a long time ago. A second and actually much more interesting and crucial distinction is to do with the interpretation of the major axis of inequality in Indian society. For the Marxists, it is class. It has always been class. The socialists very early on recognized the vital importance of caste as an organizing principle of hierarchy, discrimination, exclusion in Indian society. And from the 30s and 40s, pioneering socialist thinkers such as Ram Manohar Lohia and others really said that much more important than class is caste. So social mobilization should be on the basis of the caste rather than class. Policy reform in terms of affirmative action and quotas should be on the basis of caste. And at least till the 1990s, the communists denied the importance of caste or merely saw it as an epiphenomenon of class. A third distinction has to do with strategies of economic development. The Indian Marxists, like Marxists everywhere, have seen the state, the centralized unitary state, adopting planning, omniscient planning on the kind of socialist or Soviet model as the main agency of economic development. They're hostile to the market, of course, and they see centralized planning as a rational, systematic, scientific alternative to promote both economic development and inequality, to reduce inequality between classes. The socialists, on the other hand, had a bottom-up grassroots perspective. For them, the village was the center of economic development. You had to mobilize rural communities to manage their land, their water, their forests. You had to decentralize political authority from the state to the province, down to the district and to the village. So on economic development, ideologically, they've had very different perspectives. Now, there's a fascinating history to be written about the encounters between Marxist socialists and non-Marxist socialists in India over the 20th century. They have actually quite substantially influenced each other. It's been a very interesting interaction. They've been hostile, they've been critical of each other, they've been adversaries, they've been terrific polemics, personalized polemics, but they have influenced each other. I think, for example, the state in India that has most systematically and, in a sense, substantively taken forward political decentralization is the state of Kerala, though it was run by an orthodox Marxist regime. I think, likewise with caste, I think the non-Marxist socialists have had an impact. Perhaps even gender. One of the most extraordinary figures in Indian history who really awaits her biographer is someone called Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay. who was a pioneer of the feminist movement, a socialist, and and I think the communists have become more sensitive to gender because of this. So I'll make 3 points in conclusion. A fascinating history waits to be written of the influence and importance of socialism in India, told through the communist, non-communist dialectic. The second point I'd make is that, of course, which is why this roundtable is so timely for India, history certainly didn't end in 1989, and socialism is still unfolding. Varieties are still unfolding. In India today, you have the rise of a revolutionary Maoist movement. Maoism may be dead in China, but large parts of central and eastern India are actually, dominated by left-wing revolutionaries. And I can speak about this in the discussion, if you will. The last point I'd like to make is to do with charismatic figures. As I said, from the lens of communism or socialism, India has not possessed a Mao, a Ho, a Lenin, a Castro, whatever. But there be two charismatic figures. One who's talked about in the socialist context is Jawaharlal Nehru, who in theory was committed to socialism, a kind of incremental, gradual, Fabian socialist tradition of the British variety, and of course who was a Democrat in a political sense, but in his economic policies promoted state planning on the Soviet model. But the more interesting figure, whom it may be somewhat surprising to be talked about when we speak about socialism, is actually Mohandas K. Gandhi. Gandhi is unclassifiable in conventional political terms. Was he a liberal? Was he a conservative? Was he a socialist? Was he all of the above? But there are aspects of his life and work that have influenced both the communist and the non-communist socialist tradition in India. For example, asceticism, personal honesty. I think the Indian communists today are the only politicians in India who do not have Swiss bank accounts. And they probably got it from Gandhi. I mean,
the socialists?
Huh? The socialists by now have Swiss bank accounts. All right. The emphasis on caste, decentralized development, for example, it was a Gandhian consideration. I think the kind of unconscious, unacknowledged, subterranean influence of Gandhi on Indian socialism perhaps awaits deeper inquiry, and I'm grateful for this panel for allowing me to, throw out these sort of somewhat speculative ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much.